Hey everybody, so I've had the M2 competition for 3 track days now, and I think at this point a natural thing to ask is, with everything that I've done to the car, how does the car feel and how to have all of the mods individually performed on their own? So I think I'm going to talk about 3 of them today. We'll start with the front sway bar, the lower control arms or wishbones, the SPL adjustable ones, and finally the AP Racing brake kit. So let's start by talking about the front sway bar. To recap, I have the M2 CS Racing front sway bar, which I ordered from a US dealer. I called them up, had a chat with the parts guy. Honestly, I didn't have any problems ordering it. It was just like ordering any other part for me. And it showed up at my door in like 3 to 4 weeks because it has to be shipped from Germany. But anyhow, looking at that sway bar, it looks identical to the H&R bar, aside from maybe the color. Like all the rest of the specs and the styling, where the end links mount to looks the same as the H&R bar. So I'm very positive that it is the same bar. And anyhow, when I got it on the car, got it on the street, I would say that since I was very cognizant of what I was doing, I would say that the change was very noticeable right from the bat. Now that said, I'm not going to say it was worlds apart. If you did a blind test, hopped into a car, you would probably notice it, but it was a little bit more on the subtle side. The other weekend when I had a friend with me who also has an M2 competition, but stock front sway bar, he said he could tell that the front end of my car felt a little bit more solid, a little bit more planted. And in regards to the front end's solidity, that should be very apparent, because when you go to a stiffer front sway bar, you're coupling both of the wheels, both sides together more, and essentially making the car closer to a solid front axle. So that solid feeling, it's nice on the street, and you're definitely not going to think that this is creating too much understeer on the street. It feels good. It almost feels like if you were to put a bracing, like a strut bar, if you didn't have one, in the engine bay, that tightens up the front end a bit. So I think that sway bar in a street context, it is a good modification to make. Definitely worth it with how easy it is to swap it and how cheap that bar was. I paid like $280 shipped for it, I think. So what about on the track? Well, on the track, these cars are a little bit camber limited, and what we're trying to do with that front sway bar is we're trying to limit the amount of compression due to roll that happens in order to keep the strut in the travel range where you still have negative camber and you're not losing that negative camber. And to that effect, I do think that the front sway bar was pretty effective. I will say that the car is still a little bit understeer biased. That said, you can get out of that, right? You add some more steering angle, add some throttle, you can still very controllably kick the rear end out. At Sonoma, I played around with this a lot at turn 7. It wasn't hard for me to get the rear end to come out. That's not really an issue in my opinion about having the car being slightly understeer biased. Now, that said, on some really tight corners like turn 11, where let's say I'm not playing around with that because there are walls everywhere, I could notice that bit of understeer bias. The car's front didn't want to pull quite into the in as close and as quickly and rotate around as much as I might have liked. But that said, I may be able to change that with more camber later on. So at the track, I think if you're pairing this with camber plates, then it's also going to be a pretty good modification. And even if you're only able to do, let's say, -2 camber, it could still be worth it, because when you're at that low camber, from just doing, let's say, the camber correction hubs, you're going to want to try and keep your compression in as much of that negative camber region as possible, because you are so limited. So anyways, happy with that mod. I'm definitely not regretting it. Speaking of camber, let's go ahead and talk about the SPL lower control arms next. So I got the SPL lower control arms because they would allow me to get more negative camber by extending the length of that arm, and also would make the track width a little bit wider for a little bit more front end stability and also a little bit less roll. And I'm actually pretty happy with how that turned out. SPL says that you should be able to get up to like -4 degrees, but that's complete bollocks unless you've lowered the car significantly. I went to the max allowed length on the stock, dampers and springs, and it only got me to minus 2.3 degrees negative camber in front. That said, looking at my tire wears on the A052s after all these track days, the wear is pretty even. On the front, I can definitely tell that I am still getting a little bit more shoulder wear, so the bias is up front, a little bit more outside, just like when you're camber limited. But it's not nearly as severe as I would have thought. And I am adjusting my tire pressures, using my perometer to make sure that I am trying to get the most even wear possible and the most grip. So that said, at stock height, minus 2.3 degrees, you probably could go more. And, I do have a pair of camber plates on order, so I'm going to try and push that up to, maybe another half a degree or a bit more to about minus 2.8, minus 3 degrees in the front. And somebody else on the channel commented that by pushing out that arm, I should actually be giving myself a better camber curve as the wheel compresses, or as the suspension compresses. And you know what? Thinking about that more, they're absolutely right. By lengthening that arm, I'm making the compression distance greater before I would be entering into that region of the McPherson strut compression where you start losing camber. So that's another really nice benefit of that there. So overall, the SPL arms, how they performed, I have been happy with those lower control arms. Probably the one downside to those control arms, instead of going camber plates, aside from, let's say, being limited to minus 2.3 degrees, is since it operates by pushing the bottom of the wheel out instead of pulling the top of the wheel in, I am sacrificing some amount of clearance to the fender, and I found that on some very heavy compression areas, particularly at Sonoma between 3A and 3B, my wheel was actually rubbing the fender a little bit because it is wider than stock. So that is something you want to think about, and at the end of the day, I'm going to be pairing camber plates with this anyways. So using this purely as a camber plate replacement, if you're really trying to push it at the track, it's not going to get you all the way there. If you're trying to do it for a street car and just looking for a decent amount of camber on the street, then absolutely it should work for you. But then there are the trade-offs of the unsealed ball joints and whatnot on there. So it's kind of an interesting spot where I think that for the amount of camber you get, it'd be really nice on a street car, but I also wish that those ball joints had some more protection and were sealed. So someone asked about the SPL arms if I'm worried about bending the strut because I'm pushing the bottom of the wheel out. And to be quite honest, I'm really not. The piston shafts are designed to take quite a bit of lateral load, and especially if you go to an aftermarket design that's using like a monotube inverted, you really don't have to worry about that. Another thing is if you look at how it's mounted in the stock top mount, that stock top mount is basically a metal washer with a bump stop like pure foam material encasing it. And so that is definitely going to deflect before your piston shaft of your damper is. So that's not really something I would worry about at all. Lastly, let's talk about the brakes. The AP Racing brake kit, so far it's been absolutely fantastic. I've read lots of stories online about with the stock calipers, people getting pad knockback and having to prime their brake pedal before going to a braking zone so that the pads butt right up against the rotor. With the AP kit and their anti-knockback springs, I have had none of that whatsoever. The pads themselves, I have the DS2500s for the street, and I use the DS3.12s at the track. What can I say? They stop you very well in both situations. That said, there are some downsides to those pads on this kit in particular. Particularly the DS2500s on the street, they still squeal quite a bit. And the interesting thing is if you spend the extra money on the anti-rattle clips, and I'm going to talk about these anti-rattle clips because it's an important point here. They're called anti-rattle clips, not anti-squeal clips. I mistakenly thought that anti-rattle also meant anti-squeal, and the fact of the matter is interestingly, the DS2500s on the street squeal more with the anti-rattle clips on them than they do without. So the anti-rattle clips, they do what their namesake is, and they stop the pads from rattling around in the calipers. And to be quite honest, like, if you didn't know it, you would think you would have loose stuff in your suspension, because the noise from the pads rattling around, especially if you're driving over like expansion joints or broken pavement, is quite significant. You know, if you're someone who drives with the radio on, you probably won't notice it, but if you drive without the radio on, you're going to definitely notice it. At the track, the DS3.12s, I'm actually really happy with them. You know, a lot of people have said that they really enjoy them, and to me, they feel very natural coming from PFC 08s on my 328 D-Wagon. Like, quite frankly, I don't feel much difference in how I behave in my braking between the two cars, in terms of, you know, putting a certain amount of force on the pedal and getting, you know, a certain amount back in terms of braking. Now, you know, it's not something like when I went from Paget RSL 29s to the PFC 08s on the wagon, right? That was same car, two different pads, and completely different pedal movements. It took me a day to get used to the PFC 08 response on that car. But going from the PFC 08s on my 328 D-Wagon to the Ferodo DS3.12s, super natural. The pads have done fantastic. You know, they always have more when I want more. I can, you know, lock up the brakes if I really want to. So I know they have plenty of capability, and they haven't really worn all of that much in 3 days. So that's also pretty nice. Now, one thing I will say, swapping between pads on the AP kit is it's actually not that easy compared to a lot of other kits. And the biggest challenge with the AP Racing kit and swapping pads is getting the pads out. Like, you know, the pads don't have any ears for pins or anything, so there's nothing you can like put a hook into to pull out the pads. And also the width between the pad backing plates is so great that my pad spreader doesn't have enough extension to actually move the pads away. So you have to be a little bit creative. You know, I actually use a screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver in the in the slotted section of the pad to try and lever them out a little bit. And once that's out a bit, then I can use some other methods to try and use my brake pad spreader to spread them apart in order to pop them out. But yeah, that's really not as fast as I was expecting. So that was kind of surprising. That said, you know, it's still a great brake kit. It's still sure as hell beats taking the front caliper off of the car like you do with the stock brakes. So I'm still very happy with them. One thing I thought was kind of interesting about the AP kit is it's very obvious that with the, you know, dust shields removed, that the inside of the caliper, or the side of the caliper facing the car, gets better cooling than the outside. And the way I can tell this is when I've been taking out my pads after the track, the paint on the back of the pad backers is all like, you know, crusted and flaking off on the pad that was on the outer part of the caliper, but it still, you know, looks perfectly intact on the one on the inside of the car. So it's really interesting to see how it seems like the outside caliper or the outside pad is getting heated up more than the inside one. So there you go, guys. That's some quick thoughts on the M2CS Racing front sway bar, the SPL adjustable lower control arms, and the AP Racing brake kit. I can't honestly say that I regret doing any of that for my car, which is still set up with the stock dampers and springs right now. And depending on your car, you know, it may or may not be beneficial to do it. For example, if you're running an aftermarket coilover kit that has, you know, very stiff front spring rates relative to the rear, that front sway bar may actually be quite detrimental to you and induce just a ton of understeer, because you're already understeer biasing the car with those higher front spring rates. So really, you know, you have to think about your suspension in its entirety, but at least if you're running stock, then, well, you know, looks like all these should work out for you. I think for me, the next thing is going to be to put on some camber plates, give myself, you know, closer to -3 degrees, see if that gives me the front grip and, you know, allows me to pull into the corners a little bit better. But aside from that, you know, I'm pretty happy with the car as it is. And once I get that baseline with those camber plates, then it's going to be time to start switching up suspensions.